Welcome to the Belly Button Window channel and episode 48 of the Jimi Hendrix story, like you've never heard it before. In this episode, we explore the continuing aftermath to Jimi's death, in particular, the legal wrangling and estate litigation. Please remember to check the channel's community tab and video information page, where you will find links to related videos, performances, and stunning photographs from the period. 3 days after Jimi Hendrix's funeral, Janis Joplin died in Hollywood of a heroin overdose. Then 9 months after that, Jim Morrison died of a heart attack in Paris. Like Jimi, both Joplin and Morrison were only 27 years old. Though Jimi's death ended any idea of the experience reuniting, it only began the fighting over Jimi's estate. Band members and managers kept battling as the years passed. In fact, the Hendrix estate is one of the most litigated in the history of entertainment litigation, which include copyrights and royalty rights. When Hendrix unexpectedly passed away, he did not have a will. His father, Al Hendrix, inherited his estate, becoming the protector of his legacy. Though Al Hendrix inherited Jimi's assets, Michael Jeffrey informed him that there was little cash in Jimi's account. Al asked attorney Ken Haygood to administer what there was. When they turned the estate over to us, it had $20,000, Haygood recalled. We had to go about renegotiating a lot of the recording company relationships. Jeffrey had it all locked up and tied away. That led to a protracted 2 or 3 year negotiation with Jeffrey that we called the final settlement. According to Noel Redding, once the formalities were over, it was business as usual. In fact, it was better than usual business. There were, of course, many financial considerations. To a record company, a star is better dead than fading. During a star's natural career decline, an unsuccessful album release can do serious damage to the back catalogue. Death, however, tends to bolster sales, unloads all those albums languishing in warehouses. The marketing of Jimi Hendrix was well developed while he was alive, but with his death it was raised to a whole new level, and far more Hendrix product has come out since his death than came out while he was alive. From my point of view, and Mitch's as well, Jimi was the only honest link with the rat's nest that was the experience, and his death severed our last connection with the earnings generated by the 3 years of work. It also made it impossible to answer many questions central to our legal concerns. Our ongoing negotiations with Jimi, with management, with troops of lawyers and accountants were suddenly swamped by claims over the right to administer Jimi's estate. Jimi had died without a will, so there was a lot to be sorted out. Noel goes on to say that, because they had become Jimi's personal lawyers, Steingarten, Wedin and Weiss took the driving seat and were soon in charge of all income from all sources. All claims to experience income, including mine and Mitch's, were put on hold because of the setup, whereby much experience income was collected in Jimi's name before being redistributed. The European royalties, of course, were still tied up by the PPX suit. Mitch was so overcome by paranoia concerning the outcome of negotiations over the estate that he begged me not to do any interviews for fear that I'd tell stories about on-the-road escapades which might spoil our claims. Hendrix had died, but somehow Mitch and I, though tired, had survived. I met people who deeply resented this fact. After Jimi's death, Al Hendrix wasn't interested in his inherited share of the Electric Lady Studios, even though Jimi had personally invested $500,000 into it. Al sold his share to Mike Jeffrey for $240,000, which he paid in installments, and Jeffrey also agreed to take on the $300,000 loan from Warner Brothers. Meanwhile, Warner and Track Polydor were screaming for the 4th studio album, which came in the form of the Cry of Love album. There was also the score of the Rainbow Bridge movie that Jimi had signed up to compose. As it turned out, the Electric Lady Studios became a resounding success for Mike Jeffrey. From the 1970s onwards, the studio recorded albums by such rock luminaries as the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, David Bowie, and Patti Smith, among many others. And it remains one of the world's leading studios to this day. Jeffrey was also keen to exploit the posthumous market that had developed after Hendrix's death and was working with sound engineer Eddie Kramer to salvage as much recorded material as possible to sell on to Warner's. He didn't want to flood the market with substandard recordings, even though he knew there would be a ready market for any Hendrix material. While any tapes they couldn't use were sent to the Hendrix estate. In spite of his attempts to market only quality Hendrix material, Jeffrey was criticized for his part in the release of the movie Rainbow Bridge in 1971. The following year, Jeffrey released a movie of Hendrix's performance in Berkeley entitled Jimmy Plays Berkeley. To accompany the film, two of Jeffery's acts, Cat Mother and the All Night Newsboys, and Jimmy and Vella, performed live at venues throughout the UK. The various legal proceedings arising from Jimi Hendrix's 1965 contract with Ed Chalpin of PPX International had been suspended following Hendrix's death. The case finally came to court in London in March 1973. There were various litigants, including Track Records, Polydor, Mike Jeffery, Chas Chandler, and the Jimi Hendrix estate, all represented by Leo Branton. Before the hearing, Branton attempted to resolve the issues with Ed Chalpin with an out-of-court settlement, but Chalpin refused. On 7th March 1973, Ed Chalpin lost his long-running case and was ordered by the judge to hand over $150,000 plus costs. However, Chalpin's defeat was tempered by the judge's decision to allow him to continue promoting the Hendrix albums that Chalpin already had on the market. The weekend before the judge was due to announce the verdict on the Chalpin case, Mike Jeffery had gone to Mallorca. After concluding his business there, Mike Jeffery boarded a London-bound Iberian Airways plane at Son Sant Joan Airport in Palma. He was anxious to hear the verdict in the Chalpin case. If the outcome went against Chalpin, then he stood to make a lot of money. As Hendrix's manager, he would be entitled to a share of the withheld royalties on all Hendrix's UK record sales since 1968. In spite of Mike Jeffery's background as an undercover operative with Army intelligence and his alleged involvement in covert operations, it is well documented that throughout his life he had a fear of flying and a phobia that one day he would perish in an air disaster. As a result, he had a habit of changing his travel plans by booking himself on multiple flights with different airlines and then selecting one at random at the last minute, his way of dealing with his fear of flying and his belief that he could outsmart fate. One of his employees, Bob Levine, said of his fear of flying, "On the plane, he'd grip the armrests so tightly his knuckles would turn white. During the takeoff, he'd grab your hand so hard you'd think it was broken." On the 5th of March 1973, Mike Jeffery's morbid prophecy became a reality. At the beginning of March, French air traffic controllers were on strike and military air traffic controllers were brought in to replace them. Due to a misunderstanding, the pilot of the Iberian DC-9, in which Mike Jeffery was traveling, ended up in the same flight path as another aircraft, a Spantax Coronado. The two planes collided in mid-air near the French town of Nantes in the Vendée area. The Spandex sustained some damage, but was able to fly away and land safely. Unfortunately, the DC-9 was severely damaged. It exploded in mid-air and plummeted to the ground, and all the 63 passengers and 5 Spanish flight crew on board were killed. Jeffery's body was so badly mangled that identification was difficult. Jerry Stickles, one of Hendrix's former road managers, flew to France to make the identification. He said, "I identified him by his jewelry. Mike Jeffery's death was registered at the Commune de la Planche, Loire-Atlantique, France. On the 15th March 1973, administration of Jeffery's estate was granted to his estranged wife, Gillian Rosemary Jeffery. In spite of the fact that Jeffery had been running clubs in Mallorca, owned the Electric Lady Studios, and had various addresses in London, New York, and Mallorca, he presumably must have had a lot of debt and undischarged loans arising from the Rainbow Bridge movie and the purchase of the studio. As a sworn affidavit to the Inland Revenue in the UK showed the gross value of the estate of Michael Frank Jeffery as nil. With Jeffery gone, Al Hendrix agreed to let a lawyer named Leo Branton assume control of the legacy. Branton had worked with civil rights pioneer Rosa Parks and also handled the estate of Nat King Cole, and these qualifications were enough for Al to give him near-total control. In 1974, on Branton's advice, Al Hendrix signed over Jimmy's rights to a Panamanian company, represented by Branton. Soon after, the rights were passed on to two offshore companies, Elba B5, a Dutch company that licensed Hendrix's recordings to Warner Brothers in the US, and Interlit in the British Virgin Islands, dealing with Polygram, which had distribution rights for all territories outside the US. Leo Branton represented Elba, Interlit, Bella Godiva, who handled the US publishing rights, and another Hendrix-related company, Are You Experienced, Limited, run by Alan Douglas. In 1993, when the US catalog rights were sold to MCA, the Hendrix family was furious. Al believed he continued to hold the rights and had licensed them in a rental arrangement. Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft and a Hendrix fan, offered the family his financial support in any lawsuit that they may bring against Branton and Douglas. The family took court action against Branton alleging conflict of interest and breach of trust which, due in no small part to Allen's involvement, would have been difficult and expensive to defend. Branton settled out of court for an undisclosed sum. At this point, Al Hendrix took control of the copyright on Jimi's entire recorded output, including unreleased recordings, music publishing rights, photos, films, videos, and the right to exploit Jimi's image. Leo Branton brought in record producer Alan Douglas, who took creative control of Jimi's posthumous releases. Douglas had done a small amount of work with Jimi previously. He would be in charge of Jimi's musical legacy for the next 13 years. Douglas first crossed paths with Hendrix shortly after his performance at Woodstock in 1969, and it was supposedly through Douglas that Hendrix met and began jamming with jazz musicians, including Miles Davis, Quincy Jones, and Gil Evans, as well as the Last Poets. Douglas attended Hendrix's funeral in 1970, and 4 years after Hendrix's death, Douglas acquired the rights to produce music that Hendrix had never released. Douglas's production work on a few of Hendrix's posthumous releases is controversial. This is primarily due to tracks on the Crash Landing and Midnight Lightning LP releases in 1975. On these releases, Douglas replaced the original drum and bass tracks and added guitar overdubs newly recorded by session musicians. He added female backing singers to one track and claimed co-composer credit on several tracks that he had altered. All things considered, it's highly unlikely that Hendrix would have sanctioned the release of poorly executed material, yet the die was cast, and the producer has been branded a controversial figure ever since. In 1995, Douglas lost control of the Hendrix archive to Hendrix's father, Al. After years of legal wrangling, Douglas was also able to obtain the right to compile Hendrix's writings into a book, Starting at Zero, which was published in late 2013. He was also planning a documentary film of the same title which remained unreleased at the time of his death in 2014. In 1973, Noel Redding agreed to a $100,000 buyout of all his future rights to royalties from the Experience catalog. Mitch Mitchell agreed to a similar buyout for $300,000. At the time, neither man had any inkling of how lucrative compact disc and DVD technology would later make the estate. None of the other musicians who played with Jimi, including Buddy Miles and Billy Cox, benefited financially from Jimi's record sales or from his estate. Billy Cox had played with Jimi on and off for almost a decade, and his friendship back in their army days had been crucial in boosting Jimi's self-confidence. Billy had co-written a number of songs with Jimi, though he never received credit for them. In the studio, I think they just put Jimi on the credits, and we were going to take care of the paperwork later, Cox said. Cox was one of the few who did not become bitter in later years, despite his failure to receive the wealth that he was due. I probably would have played with Jimi for $1, he said. In 2004, Buddy Miles began legal action to seek royalties he said he was owed. He claimed that the band of Gypsys had been a partnership, and thus he deserved royalties from album sales. Unfortunately, the Hendrix estate still had many more court dates in its future. Al Hendrix died in 2002 and left the solidly profitable Experience Hendrix LLC to his adopted daughter, Janie, a decision that didn't sit well with his biological son, Leon, who launched his own legal battle, asserting that Janie had somehow finagled her way into Al's will at his expense. The courts sided in Janie's favor, but lawyers continued racking up Hendrix-related billable hours, with everything from an allegedly stolen guitar to Leon's line of official Jimi Hendrix marijuana products, prompting lawsuits and other legal bickering. With Hendrix's music as popular as ever and merchandising opportunities continuing to expand, the courtroom battles seem likely to continue. In fact, despite Redding and Mitchell dying in 2003 and 2008, respectively, the companies controlling their estates filed a lawsuit, initially in February 2022, claiming they are owed a share of the royalties from the song catalogue they performed on, arguing that the pair have not been compensated for their work and both died in relative poverty. Sony attempted to have the lawsuit thrown out, arguing that the statements the pair signed should prevent it coming to court. But in January of this year, Judge Michael Green in London's High Court ruled that the case could move to trial, most likely in 2025. According to a report in the Guardian newspaper, lawyers from the Redding and Mitchell estates have previously argued that Sony are not party to the contracts the pair signed, and the contracts do not extend to encompass lawsuits against Hendrix's heirs. They also argued that the only royalties encompassed by those contracts are from the North American market. Redding and Mitchell's estates are looking for a royalty share in line with the musician's original agreement with Hendrix, 25% each, with Hendrix taking 50%. The initial 2022 lawsuit looked to reassign the copyright and seek lost revenue and interest on that sum, plus damages and legal costs. Plans to sue over the copyright share date back to 2003, shortly before Redding died, with his manager Ian Grant saying after his death, "Noel told me, 'Ian, if I do win $5 million, I'll only give it away.' And I'm sure he would have done. It wasn't about the money. He had been denied his rights every which way." That concludes this installment of the series. Stay tuned for future episodes, where we will continue to explore the impact of Jimi's untimely death, along with the influence and legacy that continues to reverberate to this day. In addition, keep an eye out for updates to earlier episodes, as we add new details and images to the Hendrix story, not to mention new music-related content. Don't forget to subscribe for future content updates. And by the way, if you have any photos, stories, ideas, or feedback to contribute, we would love to hear from you. Until next time.